So art history, museum and gallery studies, art, and now cultural studies. It's sort of like everything. Yes.
I'm Elspeth and I'm doing the MA Cultural Studies.
And we met in the institute. Yes.
I'm Alice and I'm doing history of art.
History of art. Okay. Great. And I am Carolyn, trying to turn this thing on. Do you think I should do Control-Alt-Delete? No.
No. Okay. Wait a second.
Or use the Windows security button.
Oh,
excuse me.
I'm going to use this. I'm sorry, I should pay attention to all these different levels of.
It is very complicated for me to speak in a short amount of time of the entire documenta and make it somehow meaningful, especially considering that we are not in the presence of the artworks and of the non-artworks, because they were both artworks and not artworks in the Documenta 13. That's another aspect of it.
Wait a second.
PC, no signal.
That doesn't have to be PC, no signal. Be in that laptop.
Yes? So maybe I need to do this. This one. Huh. Oh gosh. It! We got it. Okay. It's gone. No, it's there. It's just not visible here.
No, it won't come. It won't come up on there. It'll come say on your thing. Okay, now I have to.
It's interesting because I should be able to see it on here as well.
On your own.
Yes, it's okay.
Go back to your.
Okay, I know what I can do. I can just turn it around and look at it with you in a way. You know, usually you can see
your things, because you must have to just need to mirror.
Okay, it's back here.
Sorry, you need to go to whatever it says mirror. Where?
You. Slideshow.
Yeah, let's do the slideshow.
Yes, it does it. Okay, perfect. Okay. So this is not exactly a lecture about Documenta, as you know. It is a class. So I hope that part of the way that we can navigate this problem will be through being guided through a certain number of texts and discussion with you. And I believe that you've received a letter to a friend and some excerpts from this book, which is
the logbook.
Logbook. Now, this woman is Bettina Funk, and that is my dog, Darcy. And these are the pages of the logbook, just so that we know that books are made by people, and people together talk, discuss, think, design, and work together. So I thought I would just put that image up so that we know what we're coming from. And what this image tells you is that I'm interested in the collaborations also of many different species. That said, no, I mean, I believe that when I was walking over here, I was wondering how to approach this and how to, I do have a PowerPoint, I do have things I want to tell you, but in some ways to connect with what Griselda was saying about the no concept concept, I see Documenta 13 as potentially meaningless, but also meaningful, very meaningful. Meaningless because in the bigger picture of the world and of the state of the world, of the power struggles in the world, of the ecological crisis in the world, of the pain that traverses the world in terms of people's lives, it could be considered meaningless that 860,000 people came to Kassel or 40,000 went to the exhibition in Kabul, or 20 took part in the retreat in Banff, or 50, 60 took part in the seminar about hope and sleep in Alexandria, it could seem meaningless. And that big question of the relationship between what we do, artistic practice or art exhibition making or cultural studies in the world today, is a question. I mean, if one doesn't pose that question, I think you can't even begin to practice in this field. And it has to do with a very careful also analysis of the abuse of art and the abuses that art has been subjected to and is subject to, not just the artists but also the artworks throughout history. The loss, the destruction, the misuses, the investments that are going on around it, and so on and so forth. But this is not a lecture about the art system and the position of Documenta within the art system. So I will only briefly say that Documenta in general, and my Documenta, I felt, and when I started this process, as a kind of surviving structure that marked also one of the, in a way, best aspects of the 20th century. The belief that after World War II in Europe, that 20th century in Europe, that somehow art had a role to play, visual arts, because of its not being primarily based on verbal language and therefore on the difficulty of translation and so on, that somehow this abstract informe, it was called informe, the abstract expressionism in America, informe in France, or informel, excuse me, not informe, informel, that this loose, materic, densely material work made by people called artists could provide a platform for the rebuilding of civic societies and also for the building of an internationalism, peaceful, let's say, internationalism. This is like cultural politics I'm speaking about, because to use the word peace is a really tricky one. But in cultural politics, that it could be a platform through which, severed from the political nature of internationalism in the early 20th century avant-garde, severed from the revolutionary Marxist positions of the avant-garde artists, or fascist positions for that matter, because of the futurists were fascist, of the early 20th century avant-garde, severed from that, there could be this ideal of an international language, which is a language of other senses, which are vision and touch and smell and taste, but mostly it was vision and secondarily touch with sculpture. That this could be an avenue for this rebuilding of civic society and internationalism. So it runs kind of parallel to post-war liberal international thinking. Okay, that was behind the United Nations and a bunch of things. But now, that's at the root of the Documenta. But it's always good to, this is a picture of the first Documenta in 1955, the sign. It was supposed to be just a single exhibition, not a periodic one. This is the same building the day before my exhibition opened, our exhibition, because it was a big collaborative effort between myself, other so-called curators. That's a whole other chapter. What is a curator, and the rise of this word, and the misuse and abuse of the curatorial practice, or the dreams and utopia of the curatorial practice, and so on. And artists, and scientists, and farmers, and activists, and many, many people that are in different fields. But given that my experience in life brings me closer to art than these other fields, there was a small number of scientists and farmers and seed experts and writers, fiction writers. There were these elements, Marie Dariussec and Mario Balatin and other writers, but primarily the people that made the Documenta 13 were primarily hovering around what we traditionally call the visual arts. However, it was very important that on the back of the catalogs there were 100 small books that were published in the course of 2 years prior to the Documenta opening, including a small notebook by Griselda Polak.
I already showed how proud I was.
Oh, yes. And how honored I was that you accepted. And these notebooks were then collected into one of the 3 volumes of the catalog. And the 3 at the end volumes were the guidebook, the book of books, which is of course also a book of books because it collects the 100 notebooks, but also an ironic reference with the Bible. You know, the book of books should be the book that gives you the total knowledge from an absolute and universal perspective. And of course this does not. I mean, if you know anything about Documenta 13, it is not a relativist project in the sense that I do not, I never supported relativist positions, because relativist positions can easily end up in moral relativism and can easily end up in tragedies, such as the Holocaust and many other things. So it's not a relativist project, but it is a project committed to the partiality of knowledges, partiality, and therefore that the combination or the somehow coming together of different partialities can, not anything, but the coming together of different partialities can make something more meaningful, more layered, more complex, more useful also to the transformation or to living on the planet better in the future. Okay, but what I wanted to say was that on the back of the different books, and all the 3 have them, you will have all the participants in, without specification of whether they are artists, or you will find Griselda Polak's name the same as you will find Michael Rakovitz, and it was very important for me to do that. So nobody ever could say, you can't say how many artists were in the Documenta 13. Well, maybe 150, maybe less, maybe more, because it's difficult to define a person. Sometimes a person is an artist and a curator and an activist, and I had a certain number of categories: cultural, theorist, but there were many. It was even ornithologists, so studying birds, and so many people had different tags, and therefore they would come up on the internet. If you looked up that category, you would get a certain number of people would come up with many different hats and definitions. And to not do that complex tagging, which you cannot do on a flat bidimensional surface of paper, we removed them all. So you have a lot of people here, like Anton Zellinger, who's a quantum physicist, in the same list, which might have something to do with broadening the boundaries of what we define as art. And I think that has always been the task of art, whether intentional or non-intentional. Art has always redefined itself throughout histories. And but in this moment of history, it is a very important political task to do that, because we are living in the financialization of art. We are living in an era where art has become an investment, and people can buy pieces of artworks. I mean, the bacon was sold for how many millions of euros? I think a month ago there was a bacon, Francis Bacon sold for 220 million euros or something, which means that no individual, no emirate, no company even would buy that. So it's clearly an investment. It's part of some sort of you can buy a small portion of it as you might even not know that you own it in a way. So in this moment where you have this financialization of art to such a degree, finance needs it to be quite clear, because if you're going to invest in toothpaste, you better know what toothpaste is. So it seems to be a task of liberation, like a liberation of art, to test those boundaries and to break those boundaries, which in any case art has always done, since time immemorial. but to allow that porosity to occur more now, because it does form a kind of resistance to the possibility of investment in art. Because what are you going to do? You know, put Anton Zellinger on the portfolio? You can't do that. He's a quantum physicist. But then you have to spend your time researching who is this person and who is that person. Oh no, that's a novelist. Oh no, that's a theoretician, and so on. And so it becomes, it's like making something very loose and shaky in order to make it less interesting to a certain area of control over that object. And so that is a romantic impulse of mine. So in that sense, I am a romantic, late romantic person, you know, because I want to liberate art from itself in a way. So not only is it a question of liberating people, but liberating art. Okay, so given that general framework, there are a few more general things, and then I thought we could read and comment some texts. But the general things that I wanted to say was another characteristic of this documenta was a strong sense of dispersion, first of all, of the exhibition spaces, that's true. And this dispersion in both within Kassel, you see, this is where the documenta was in Kassel. You know, it was all over the Auer Park, there would just be dots everywhere. And then these are all the places where it was. So there's nothing radically new in that, because as you know, Alana Heiss organized the Brooklyn Bridge event outside of an institution in 1971, and that was followed by many art projects in the public space throughout the last 30 years. So there was nothing radically innovative in the going out of the white cube, as you say, at all. Kazomai, on the contrary, maybe it was, what was radical was to make the white cube everywhere. So the Auer Park was full of about 25 little houses that were like prefab houses in ecologically minded construction done with a company that is at the forefront of bioarchitecture in Germany. So it was very important to me that you don't, another point was that you don't speak about ecology and then you do an exhibition that is consuming an incredible amount of energy or creating an enormous amount of waste. You have to actually make your practice and your theory kind of more connected. So that was done in many, many different ways, including a modification of the food distribution and the food given to the audience, sold and so on and so on. But these small little houses in the Auer Park that were temporary and that were built in ways to not permanently alter or damage anything were also many times small white cubes or small video projection spaces. So there was also this expanded museum. It wasn't against the museum. It was more about the expanded museum. And what that did was it slowed down the walking process from one place to another, and therefore avoided the crowds and the pain that there is when you don't have the possibility of engaging with an artwork, because it distributed, it was like a mathematical calculation, you know, how far, given that you expect 700,000 people, and given that you have such an amount of real estate in your exhibition, you're going to have a line this kilometer, you know, given that it takes, if you estimate this amount of minutes in front of a painting and this amount in front of, with the video, you can know very easily, if you do your calculations right as a so-called curator, I'm gonna have queues that last 2 hours in front of this building, 1 hour in front of this building on Saturdays. On Sundays it will be like this. So you work with people that are people that deal with questions like this, and you decide, like I decided, to go against the idea of the long queues and crowd. So apparently it was not an overcrowded exhibition, although it had 30% more audience than in the previous documenta, but it was not at all, because of the walking time between places. But it's not just about crowd control and walking time. It's about the sensorial experience the connectivity and the connections that you can make between the experience that you have before you enter into that chapel and see that fresco by Giotto, and after. So the memories you carry with you, the after images of walking in the park or walking in the train station where the Nazis from track 13 took a lot of people away during the Nazi period. And now, from these tracks at night, tanks roll out because Kassel is still a primary place of industry for military. But at the day, they don't roll them out, but they roll them out at night. And you find German-produced tanks all over the place rolling out at night. So what effect... well, I was about to take a digression into quantum again, but I won't. But there are a lot of theories around the memory that things have, you know, things and places have, and it's not necessarily fiction or mythological thinking or some sort of primitive thinking. It's actually a very subtle contemporary thinking around the trauma that materials may have memory of, and so on. But so all of these, art is autonomous, but art is not autonomous. And so in this relationship, complicated relationship between the world and the work seen as a transitional object, which we can speak about at some point, maybe in the questions, I wanted to articulate a space that was dispersed, where these sentiments and feelings of certain areas of the town would then merge in the consciousness of the visitors to create that experience. That is within Kassel. But within the world at large, the Kabul and so on, it has to do with another question, which is the question of, again, it's kind of an ethical question that may then have consequences that are political, which is that we live in the digital age in this euphoric idea that we can have access to everything, and especially if we are privileged with money, we can have access to everything. And knowledge, especially, we can have access to through the existence of the internet and this compression of space. This is the same compression of space that generations of people have been talking about. It's not new to the digital age, but the digital age is an extreme case of this hubris, this fiction of being in the, you know, in a Star Trek where you can get teletransported from one place to another. It's like a fiction. But already Heidegger, in his text from the 20s about the thing, what is a thing, he speaks about this fiction of, with airplanes, you know, they had airplanes starting to fly, and radio, the early radio, and the fiction of the compression of space so that we can have this contact, but then there's no contact because it's a fiction. And so that he distinguishes nearness, the sense of nearness, from the sense of fictitious contact. So in our age, I think it's even more extreme, and it tends to cause both a decrease of care for bodies and a decrease of care for things. That's why you blow up the Bamyan Buddhas. You know, there's been an incredible increase in the destruction of architecture and art in the last 20 years, never seen since the French Revolution period. You know, it's an amazing increase in the digital age. Instead of a decrease, increase. Except for, of course, one big area, which is architecture destruction of cities with aerial bombing, of course, that destroyed so many important things in the 20th century. But in terms of objects and movable heritage, this has increased exponentially in the last 20, 30 years. So so I wanted to create a project that was also a humbling project for the audiences. So, and it also has to do with another point, which is the unidirectionality of travel, cultural travel especially. The white Western wealthy might go to the Gwangju Biennale, or might go to, if you do a biennale in Phnom Penh, they would all go, you know. So, but if you're from a so-called non-central area of the art world, you can't do that reverse project and go to the Venice Biennale because it's Venice Biennale. So how could I create an exhibition or project that would not reverse, but that would make it equivalent? So by doing, this is one of the many reasons, it's only one. It's not the most important, but it's one. Doing the exhibition and the project in Kabul meant that this globe-trotting audience would not be able to see it, because you cannot get a visa to go unless you're unfortunately a military person or you are working for an NGO. You have to be committed to something, one sort or another. You have to work for a newspaper doing political writing, or you have to, if you're a foreigner, you can't go as a tourist to Afghanistan right now. You don't get the visa, even though officially on the website you can apply for a tourist visa, but no tourist visas are given. Visas are given to diaspora. Afghan diaspora can always go to visit relatives, and then people that are either working for NGOs or for a foreign occupying government. So, or for UNESCO if you're working for the conservation of the birds. So it created a situation, even though it's the most prominent art exhibition in the world, where almost nobody of the so-called art world would be able to go. And this balanced somehow the injustice of the way that this cultural tourism has developed in the Biennale, globalization of the Biennales. It was not about excluding. I mean, many of the students of the seminars in Afghanistan, who were young artists like yourselves, or prominent figures, did exhibit in Kassel, and many of the artists in Kassel did exhibit in Kabul, but it was about becoming aware of the fact that you cannot have every experience, and that if you're here, you are not there. If you're, while I'm here, I'm not somewhere else. And to be conscious of this in every step you take in Kassel, to be conscious of this, that it's not so expendable, you know, that you can't have everything. So that was one of the reasons of this shift. Which indeed marks something very important for the history of international exhibition making, because that had never been done. I mean, we have exhibitions everywhere, but that an exhibition frames itself in a multiplicity of venues around the world was not done before. So it furthers a project that perhaps was a project of decentralization of contemporary art, but it does so not only, for example, it follows what Okoye-Nwozo did, my predecessor, in organizing the platforms. They were these conferences organized by dOCUMENTA in different parts of the world, leading up to the last platform, which was the exhibition in Kassel. But I would say that it follows in that direction, but takes it one step further. And one of the big problems was, but this is becoming a lecture about the decentralization of dOCUMENTA, so I won't do it. Now, what I would like to do is tell you a few, oh yes, the second thing I wanted to say about this being in many areas, this is for the reading of the logbook, but being in many parts, the other reason for it is, has something to do with, again, it's not a new idea. I don't really have any new ideas. Like, I've never had an idea in my life that's new. But I like many ideas that many people have put forth into the world. And I like to put them into practice. It's like yes, to not let them just drift away, but what are the consequences of those ideas? So, for example, one of the main questions of the feminists, for example, discourse in art has been this decreasing of the power of the visual over artistic experience and culture. You know, the other one is the question of the private and the public and the interconnectedness of this, and to not have that boundary is fallacious. But one of the questions is to get out of this frontal detached gaze of the artwork, the viewer detached, the I with the capital I controls in a detached and secure position with the I this object, which traditionally was also made with a hierarchical predominance of the visual over everything. Expressed in the Renaissance perspective, but really that goes much further back. It goes back to monotheistic religions, basically, when St. Augustine in particular, he writes about the different senses, and the sense that will make us know God more is the visual, and the hearing a little bit, so the singing of the angels, and then the more you go to the so-called lower senses like touch and smell and so on, the more you are in the universe where the cow would also be able to know God. And of course the cow does not know God, and therefore we have to arrive at this space of the mental, and the eyes are argued as the sense that is a portal to the spirit, according to St. Augustine, and of course to Dante in his Divine Comedy. He ends the third canto of the Divine Comedy with a complete visual orgasm, which is about mirror and the reflection of God in the eyes of the Mary who Dante sees, cannot look at God directly, and this whole thing. So this hierarchy of the visual over the other senses has been progressively dismantled throughout the end of modernism and throughout the last 50 years with the birth of installation art and time-based works that comprise sound art, the development of sound art, with early 20th century experiments as well in tactility and so on. The utopia of the arte totale, the total art of the early 20th century. But it gains a certain force around the late 60s, and that when the arte povera artists emerged, and the minimalist artists, and a certain number of post-minimalists. And that was the basis of my formation. So I am so-called expert of arte povera. So that for me was very important, this polysensorial experience of knowledge. That knowledge is something that is not through the mind, and that this division of the mind and the body is the so-called Cartesian cut between the mind and the body, going back to Descartes, is very dangerous, because it also, it too tends to other the body. When you separate the body from that, you other the body, and therefore the body is expendable, of course, and can be destroyed. And so the way that both the way that the works were chosen, so the artists that I chose to work with, and the way that the display was made throughout the whole documenta, in each of the places, took into consideration this premise of not considering the visual necessarily the only sense or primary sense. And so when you entered into the Fridericianum, it was empty. The main venue of Documenta was empty, but you felt a breeze on your body. And that breeze was the work of Ryan Gander, who altered the flow of air in the museum in such a way as to create a density of wind in certain corners or doorways, and a loosening of the wind in other places. And this was, I'm going to show you, because if I don't show you anything, I must show you something. Just a minute. So just don't have a look at anything for a minute, and I'm just going to show you, I want to show you just the pictures of Ryan Gander. Oh, no, sorry. This is really the back end. It's like the back office. I'm going into a PowerPoint that has nothing to do with today, but there are beautiful pictures that have everything to do with today of, just a minute, Gander. I want to show you those images. Here we go. Okay, so when you entered into the Fridericianum, it was quite empty. I don't need to put the slide show. It's okay like this, no?
Mm-hmm.
And this is people in the Fridericianum, you see? And they are looking to find where the wind comes, but they don't know. So it was a kind of celebration of doubt, or a celebration of becoming aware of your body in the here and now, and wondering where the art was. That's Ryan speaking about the work. Okay, so back to us. So I spoke to you about the different venues. I spoke to you about the decrease of the visual and the increase of works. Yes, in terms of the artists that I did end up working with, you will have noticed in this documenta an increase of sculptural works, three-dimensional sculpture or installation work, and there was still, of course, video works, marvelous things, like the Autolith group made a beautiful piece called The Radiant, which was about the collapse that occurred after Fukushima nuclear power plant explosion. It was fantastic work. So there were film-based and video works, but there was much less. If you study it in perspective to the other previous documenta, there was a decrease in video and film works. So that was clearly a move away from the black cube, which had taken the place of the white cube of before, and an increase in 3D works in various materials. But you also see an increase in works that are based on the participation of people, not of the audience necessarily, sometimes of the audience, but of people. For example, in the Pierre Huyghe piece, which was a kind of a compost, a metaphorical matrix of the world. Let me give you some pictures from Pierre Huyghe just to show you. There was also 2 dogs, a bunch of tadpoles, a person who took care of the dogs, and ants, and many other things were in his piece. So basically, I think, I didn't put him in the PowerPoint. It's interesting. Thought I had. Okay, I will show you that again in this other one. Well, let me just go through this quickly so that you see. I'm sure Griselda has spoken to you about Arnold Bode, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's Bode. And that's what it looked like, the Friedensplatz after the war. This image, you must remember it. I will speak about it later. It is a picture of anonymous visitors of the Documenta in 1959 in front of the work of a Cubist sculptor from Spain called Julio González. I'm not going to comment, but I'm going to just let you see some images, and then we'll go back to some of them in the other PowerPoint. But I'm going to go all the way to Pierre Huyghe, because we mentioned him. So what I wanted to say was that I'm going to quickly skim. These are not the exhibition, that's research. This, by the way, is Song Dong, for all of you who come from China. He was one of the various Chinese artists in the exhibition. And he made a do-nothing garden by working with the trash company of Kassel. And we made like a trash heap. So it's really like a compost. It's like only organic trash and dirt as well, and stones that then became the garden in front of the orangerie. and this is a piece, what I spoke to you about sensuality, polysensoriality. This piece was not published very much in the reviews of the exhibition because it's green on green and it doesn't look good in a magazine. But when you were in front of it, it was a very overwhelming kind of a giant bonsai because it had the shape of mountainscape or miniature mountainscape, and it had a very strong smell because he planted broccoli and a lot of broccoli. So it was very, very strong, and it created a place. Many of the sculptural works actually created a place for meeting. That's what I mean by, this was trees that moved by Maria Loboda. But I'm looking for the Pierre Huyghe piece that I wanted to speak to you about, but you can tell by there it is. So this is the project description of the Pierre Huyghe piece. And in Pierre Huyghe's work, there was both remnants of past art, casts of remnants of past art, such as this sculpture, the bees, bee nests, dog, people, the caretaker, whom I don't have a picture of evidently, but he was there. So what I meant by this was that it was an exhibition that you could say was quite dense of relationality with other people, but not of relational art. Because it was not foregrounding the relation as the subject or the object of the artworks. But often, these people were combined with something. So it was very much an exhibition about the relation between things and people. What we want to do with things, what we do with things, what are things, how do we care for them, what is the history of the relation between us and things. So that was very much one of the premises I wanted to say. You can clearly see from some of the pictures that there was a strong environmental undercurrent in it, because we like the Sondong work and others. And there was an activist, there was an embracing of activist art projects as well. Many of them we might describe some. And another very strong current that ran through it was the question of historical trauma and the relationship between the personal experience, personal memory, and historical trauma. And that was had something to do with what I said previously about the increase in the destruction of the materiality of cultural heritage in the digital age. And it has to do with being in Kassel and in Germany, where there was, as you know, the Nazi-fascist period, and Kassel was the primary bomb-making place. And in Kassel, some very important events occurred, like in that square, the Nazis burnt the books. There was a big book burning in 1933, and in the same place where those books were burned, 10 years later, less than 10 years later, the British bombed the Friedrichshainum and burnt what was left, basically. And so therefore, it's this incredible destruction of the German Middle Ages in the Friedrichshainum and all other, and many other things previous to that. So destruction over destruction over destruction occurred in this city. It was also the city where the first Kristallnacht event occurred. Kristallnacht was when the shops that belonged to Jews were destroyed and the vitrines were broken, and this kind of marks the passage from theoretical anti-Semitism to acting on it in a very practical way. And the first time that occurred was they did a test in Kassel. It was the government wanted to see if the German people would make an uprising and it would create like social disturbance, demonstrations. So they tried it out in Kassel one night before every other city in Germany. And so there's this expression In Kassel fliegt das erste Stein. In Kassel flew the first stone. Kassel was where the first stone was thrown. So it is impossible for me, it was impossible to address Documenta 13 without addressing this history. And so it was addressed in a very kind of indirect way. Again, I always try to do things indirect. It's the no concept concept. I think, as Adorno, that the minute you say something, it's false. Because just by saying it, somehow it's false. You know, there is an unspeakability of things that need to be done but not spoken. I think that's my way of thinking, which is why I am curator and not a theoretician who writes books. Because I fall into a sort of aphasia when I'm in front of the written word. And although I very much hope to publish some things, and sometimes I do, as you can see in these books, but because of this, the concepts were I never wrote anywhere. This is an ecological, environmental exhibition. I didn't write that. Or this is the exhibition of Kassel where more women were included than in any previous Documenta. I never wrote that. You know, the press office tried to write these things, but I never did. It's not necessary to write it. It's important to do it, not to write it. So one of the things I didn't write was that the Documenta was about this particular, well, I didn't write it as a topic of the Documenta. That's what I didn't do. But I did something which was to invite every artist who came to visit a place called Breitenau. And Breitenau was a middle-aged monastery outside of Kassel, 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers out of Kassel. And in this monastery, Benedictine monastery, there had been a prison because Luther, you know, Luther closed the Catholic events during the religious wars and so on. And after the Lutheran period, it was no longer a Benedictine monastery, and it became a princely house for the Hessian Landgraf to go to in the countryside. And in the 1800s, it was converted into a prison. And this continued, this being an institution of reclusion continued to our day. This is what surprised me. Because it was a prison in the early 20th century, anarchists and socialists were put there. It was a prison and a labor camp during the Nazi period. Not a death camp, just a prison camp for the forced laborers that were in Kassel. Kassel was full of forced laborers, Italian, Polish, French, who were taken from their homes and forced to work in these military factories because the German men were in the army. So the foreigners were building the arms. And as a way of creating social control, without having to always have a gun pointed on people, they created Breitenau and made it very scary and made everyone know that if they were to disobey, if they were to run away, they would end up in Breitenau. So it was very important to not kill people, but to send them back to work, so that the rumor would go about this forced labor camp, which was so horrible. And of course people also died there, but it was not the objective of Breitenau. And after the war, the American government closed it. They arrived in Kassel and so on. But after just 6 months or 7 months, it had prisoners again, Nazis in this case. And then it was closed again, and then it opened in the early 1950s as a reformatory for wayward girls. So bad girls, girls who were not criminal. It was not for people who stole crime, but who were antisocial behavior, like getting drunk or getting pregnant or not answering your father properly or whatever. So this antisocial behavior of bad girls was normatized by exclusion of them in this new institution, which was a women's reformatory, girls' reformatory. In 1952, I think it opened. Interesting is that it opened at the same time as the city was gearing up for the first Documenta, 1955. So you're cleaning up the city from what you're embarrassed of in order to then make it a platform for international modernist art exhibition. So it's very complicated history. And it stayed that till the 70s. And then it was closed in the early 70s, also thanks to the work, the journalistic work done by a certain number of women, including Ulrike Meinhof. Ulrike Meinhof was one of the founders of the Baader-Meinhof terrorist groups, but before that she was a very good journalist, great journalist, and her last project was to study these reclusionary institutions for women and men too. They were separate, and thanks to the work of her and other people, there was a sensibilization against these institutions, and they were slowly closed in the early 70s. But today, Breitenau is a psychiatric institution. Yes, it's a mental hospital. It's a day hospital, so people don't have to live there, but they can live there. There are people that have lived there for 25 years, still in Breitenau. So what I did was, speaking about this repetition of the trauma and amnesia, you know, because nobody who runs the you know, it's very difficult, because they changed names. It was called Fuldahal, it was called this, it was called that. It's very difficult to have this clear history so present. So there's a little bit of archaeology there that needed to be done. And I worked with the Gedenkstätte, which is the Memorial Museum in Breitenau, to organize visits for the artists. So every artist who was in dOCUMENTA, this is a very strange thing, but because it was not written that if you want to accept dOCUMENTA, you have to go to Breitenau. I didn't say that when I invited artists, but every single artist who was invited to the dOCUMENTA was invited to Breitenau, and everyone came. But only 6 or 7 of them ended up making artworks that reference Breitenau. There was Clemens von Wedemeyer, there was the woman who worked with Avery Gordon, excuse me. I want to find her name. Well, Gerard Byrne also referenced it in his work a little bit, but that wasn't one of the. Clemens was very clear. And
Ivekovic?
Sanja Ivekovic, yes. Yes, indeed, thank you. And also Judith Hopf. Judith Hopf actually installed a work in Breitenau that maybe 100 people saw, because it wasn't in the map of the exhibition. Because it took me about 6 months. That's why we're going to read this guidebook. I'm very slow. I work very slowly. So it took me 6 months to decide whether Breitenau would be somehow a venue or not of the dOCUMENTA. And ultimately I decided not, because of the, I think the disturbance that it would have brought to the people who live there, who were the mental institution people. I think it would have turned them into, like, it would have brought a voyeurism that I didn't want. So we didn't do it, but that took like 7 months. In the meantime, Judith wanted to make a piece, so I said, do it anyway, it doesn't matter. If Emily Jassir also references it in her work. Really 6
was
or
7.
seven.
The one with the installation which referenced Meinhof, the Meinhof? That was a brilliant piece.
Yes.
Maybe I describe it to people while they were looking. Because that piece was obviously installed in a very large space, basically with 3 full-size screens in a kind of, I don't know, maybe it seemed a triangular, so you couldn't watch more than 1 film at a time.
That's Clemens von Wedemeyer, yes.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
It's beautiful.
And one piece was based on Ulrike Meinhof's journalistic reports. So it was a sort of story of one of the young women in the reformatory rebelling, so she destroys everything. One was a documentary of some young people being taken on a tour to Brighton now as a kind of memorial site, and the other was a beautifully made sort of fiction film, which was about the survivors of the final massacre. It seemed that there was the SS had taken out some of the prisoners just before the war ended.
Yes.
And massacred them. So although it wasn't a death camp, there was this particular thing, and
It's funny,
so
there's some reason why it's not appearing in my... I can't even find it. This is what you call a kind of reject...
do you want to give it to me and I'll look for it while you...
Yes, but how do we...
Well, it must be with Avery Gordon.
Yes, it's with Avery Gordon.
And Avery Gordon is a cultural theorist who wrote this wonderful book
but her
about
name is not in the...
cultural haunting, the sociology of sort of cultural haunting. So this is Avery Gordon, and so she worked with the photographer. So this book by Avery Gordon, if you've never come across it, is absolutely extraordinary.
It's very strange. Oh, Ines, that's it. Ines Schaber, S-C-H-A-B-E-R, with Avery Gordon. S-C-H-A-B-E-R. Yes, Ines Schaber and Avery Gordon did a whole study of Paitenau. It's a kind of artistic research as a methodology for the artist, and then they did this installation with video and cloth and the many, many stories which take apart this whole relationship with the girls' reformatory. Okay, but aside from those 3 or 4 or 5 that I mentioned, it was not a theme in 90% of the documenta, but everyone who did the documenta saw it. And I think it gave a kind of gravity. I mean, this trip, which is not a site visit to see just a neutral white space or to pick a gallery you want to show in, it gave a kind of sense of gravity to the participation in Documenta 13. That we weren't there just to waste time, that we were there to do something that somehow would be meaningful. And I think it comes out in every single work. I mean, there's a sort of a sense of wanting to do something that is meaningful in one way or another. So, I would like now to go to this logbook, if you agree, and we let's see how we're doing with time.
Well, we've probably got another
hour?
half hour or so.
Oh, half hour.
So, or half more. We can take a bit more, but their concentration will
Okay. Well,
wane.
yeah.
Seriously.
And you might have questions too. So, well, then it's...
Let's look at the logbook. Just
Let's look at the logbook together.
Look at it and,
so the first thing that, if you have it with you...
No, they have some off prints. They just have the bits that you sent.
Yes, of course, but you have the bits. Okay. So the introduction to the logbook. Made by this person with me. It is a collection of emails, but there were thousands of emails, of course, to prepare the documenta. And we only picked maybe 200 of them that we felt were significant and would express certain aspects of this process of making the documenta. So the first thing I wanted to do was to tell you what you have in your hands, you know? So a large piece of wood severed from a tree that has kept a record of the changing seasons through its growth. That's what a log is. A log is also the wooden float by means of which one could measure the speed of a ship. Related to time, therefore, and to one's journey, both these meanings meet in the word logbook, thus coming to signify the daily record of a vessel's passage. So this is like the logbook of a ship, and it tells you that time... Can I sit down? Yeah. Okay. It tells you that time is an important factor, and growth is an important factor in the making of Documenta 13, and that you can't grow faster than it can actually grow to make those rings. But a vessel, so the ship that is the vessel that would have its logbook, in turn
is not only a boat floating on water by displacing the water when it goes into the sea, but also a container capable of holding water, as well as many other molecular aggregations. So to see the dOCUMENTA as both a container and a contained. dOCUMENTA 13's logbook is the interstitial second volume of the exhibition catalog, belonging between the Book of Books and the guidebook. It was, of course, made after, because it also has images, I think it has images of the installation as well at the end. So it was clearly printed as the last book, but conceptually it was the second, because it was about the making of the exhibition, and the guidebook was the third, because it's what you carry in your hands when you're listening to the exhibition. But of course, this temporal loop, where the second is the third, because obviously if you see the exhibition and the visitors and you're holding the second of the third, was an intentional play on the way that time is not linear, but is circular and loops over and over in the same place, expands and contracts and loops. An attempt to record the many events and internal trajectories that have accompanied and guided the making of the project. Now, this is not, again, unique. I mean, there are some, I think, examples of previous cases where exhibitions have published the trajectory of their making. But first, it's very rare. And secondly, it's fragmentary. I mean, Harold Zeman, my predecessor, in the 1972 dOCUMENTA, in the catalog, he published his notes and his telephone numbers and notes from the making of the dOCUMENTA, so that one could see who he had visited in which city. So that it was the primary precedent for me. But the other reason for doing this is that I do firmly believe that in the digital age, we are in actually really a fragile moment in terms of the archival of the digital, in the sense that when software changes, we can't read anymore the old emails or the old documents or websites. So there is a real power struggle going on in the age of the digital as to what we will have access to and what we won't have access to in 50 years. Because 2 or 3 years are enough for the software to become obsolete and to be able to read a certain website, as we know. So more and more we end up with, there's a politics of the control of what Google, what your new software and your new laptop will be able to access or not access. And so one of the biggest challenges right now are translation, to work on translation software in order to actually make certain websites or documents accessible 10 years from now, which are already not. And there are groups actually of feminist building of search engines. There's one in Bologna, based in Bologna, they are working on to make feminist search engine that has in the search engine the software to allow you to read certain websites that you can't read anymore through Google, if you access it through Google. So that's very interesting what's going on. But what we know is that we are in a very fragile moment where we have an enormous amount of knowledge, but we have to back it up every 5 years or this or that, or upgrade, and we can lose so much. So I said, I'm going to just make a book. So it's paper, and it can be, and it of course refers to the books in the destruction of books in Kassel and reversing that process of the destruction of books. So the creation of the 100 notebooks and the printing of the emails has something to do in my concept for it or my no concept, it has something to do with reversing that destruction of the books. So that's, but I also don't believe in these, let's download everything and just print it, print out, because you can't use it. So it is actually a edited selection of emails. So it is an inner perspective on the making of dOCUMENTA 13, partial and incomplete, but reflects the variable speed of email writing. At times very short emails, very fleeting emails, but able to also embrace the slowness. There are some emails that were written very, very consciously with a lot of time, you can tell. In the middle of the night, Rabbi Mroe sending me this email, after his visit to Breitenau, Or so Peach writing me from Phnom Penh, a long email. So there's different kind of senses of time and slowness, even in the advanced digital age. It documents as well the search for a shared thinking that is not immediately visible and that hovers in the space of the propositional. So I used to use the word propositional, to be in the space of the propositional, to define this non-concept concept. That was what I would say to people when they would ask me. I don't use it very much nowadays, but maybe I should go back to it. Because people tend to understand more when you say the process. But I am not interested in the process. It's not process art and process curating. It's to be in the space of the propositional. You cannot have a closed concept or hypothesis that you want to test. So it was because I wanted to be always in that space that the concepts could merge, a certain interests would appear because of certain connections. But it wasn't about celebrating process. It was about making space for ideas to emerge. But because if you say celebrating the process, it's like as if you are fetishizing a form or a rule or a methodology. And for me, it was about the things that we could do if I didn't close it down. So to be in the space of the propositional. Okay, and there's a lot of questions of what it is to bear witness that appear in this book. Through images, correspondence, and interviews, the logbook intends to bear witness on an actual yet also symbolic level to an approach that is intuitive. So you could say that intuition is to be in the space of the propositional. Intuition is a very interesting concept, notion. Who is the person who wrote about intuition? Wordsworth. But before, maybe, there was some, what is intuition is an interesting question. But anyway, intuition into a way of proceeding that has been more tactile and embodied than projective, trying to let things and places speak with humble extravagance and even humor, connecting them in ways that are only partially traced. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these relations. Let's open the book. And the humor starts on the first page. I hope you find it funny. I was in Torino. Does anyone else want to read, or should I just keep reading?
You read.
I read? Okay. So, Torino, January 1st, 2009. I was nominated in early December 2008. Are you at page 14? Yeah? Okay. So this is how it happened. So in January, they set me up with an email, of course. And I'm in Torino because at the time I was chief curator at the Castello di Rivoli Museum in Torino. But this book is full, as is the letter to a friend, of secrets that are revealed, like Edgar Allan Poe. The Purloined Letter is one of my favorite texts. And so you put things out in the open, and is a way of not speaking and not speaking. So Torino is, of course, the hotbed of arte povera, and therefore this is an immediate statement. To start with, this email is an immediate statement about, it's also a statement about modernization and modernity, the fiat, the Italian miracle, the immigration, forced labor from the south to the north. So many things are in this word, Torino, fiat, post-war, post-Second World War, reconstruction. Test, okay, he tests, and I test, and I write back 11:40, test 11:40, meaning the time that I was writing, and he ... and back at 11:43. Between the first and the second, you have from 11:22 to 11:40, that's 18 minutes. In the second one, you have 3 minutes. And I'm talking about time and flexible intervals of time. The way time contracts and flows rapidly, and and rushes. And so we are going to make music. We are going to talk about rhythm and structures of rhythm. Okay? In fact, the documenta, one of the subtitles was on taking, no, the dance was very frenetic. I don't have the title here. But the dance was very frenetic, and there's a long it's the title of my essay in the book of books. And this question of the impossibility of synchronizing time, the impossibility of standardization of time, was also a thread through the documenta. Power is now contingent on our ability to sync, right? You have to sync the computers, sync the stock exchanges, sync everybody's lives. So syncing, and they tell us that we can sync. But actually nothing is synced. There's always an impossibility of syncing. And so this idea of a synchronized time, of globalization as this happy, felicitous synchronization of lives around the world, is one of the big myths of the alienating power of today. So this is a kind of unsynced time, the time of Lars Müller, my technician, my time, the time him in Germany and me in Torino. Okay, then I decided to put the whole logbook of where I was, so Budapest, but no emails. So one of the first trips I took was to Budapest. And there was a long debate with Bettina whether we should put these places, even though there was no email. And in the end, after like another 6 months thinking, I decided yes, because otherwise you would have a skewed idea of, I mean, many parts of the world would not be, I mean, it was more honest to say where I had been and not been, and not to conceal, so to be more honest about it. So we decided to keep it. But Budapest, of course, why was I in Budapest? I don't say here why I was in Budapest, but I was in Budapest to visit Lukács archive. And in fact, there is a notebook, one of the 100 notes, 100 thoughts, is the finding of a notebook by György Lukács, which is an incredible notebook, which contains his notes when he was a student in Berlin of Georgi Simmel. Lukács is basically the anti-Adorno, or Adorno is the anti-Lukács. There are two views of the relation between art and society. And Lukács is at the forefront of believing in realism, and out of his thinking comes also social realism. He is one of the readings of the novel. He made a sociological reading of the novel, and he lies at the back of all realist positions in 20th century art in a way. But interestingly enough, this notebook that we found, which we then published as one of the 100 notes, 100 thoughts, I found in the back of it, it was his notes of a lesson in logic. So he was following university, and he was at a philosophy class of logic. And in the middle of taking notes on philosophy of logic, on the back page, right upside down and reversed, 10 years before his most famous first text about realism, is his first intimations, his intuition of this theory that he will then write about 10 years later. So it is like the prehistory of Lukács, and it is a discovery. It is a discovery, and so of course this means that I was interested in understanding what was going on in the heart of Europe, you know? What does it mean to be in Western Europe, near where Eastern Europe was? The castle was just on the border, 60 kilometers from the border with Eastern Germany. And what is this world after 89, you know, 1989? What are we looking at? In Budapest, at the time, there is a rise of anti-Semitism. There is a rise of the right and collapse of the first early left-wing governments, not left-wing, libertarian governments after the fall of 1989. You have a certain, I wanted to go visit a philosopher called Miklas Tamás Gaspar, a very interesting philosopher who now is being translated, but was not at the time translated. And so I think dOCUMENTA, and I wanted to meet him to commission a notebook. And I did. And he wrote one of the most interesting notebooks that are the most political notebooks that you might read in this collection, Miklos Kaspar Tamas. And because I was visiting him to ask him to do a notebook, he did one of the most interesting analyses of Western Europe in this moment. We went to the Lukács archive, and in the Lukács archive, we were looking at the various things, and I found this notebook. Now, this particular notebook, which became a notebook, marks one line of the notebooks. That sounds like Gertrude Stein. One line of the notebooks are to print facsimiles of real notebooks. So what is a notebook? A notebook, a real notebook, like this notebook for me, when I was thinking about this class, is it's in the state of the propositional. It's writing in the state of the propositional, because it's also fragile, because you are afraid you will forget. And so you jot down this, thinking that in the future you might forget and it might come in handy. So there's this back and forth of time, there's this optimism in the notebook that you will take the notes for some future text you will write, or for something you don't want to forget to tell the students and so on. So this being in the state of the propositional of the notebook per se was one of the themes of the whole project of printing the notebooks. So I wanted to see these notebooks, but I also wanted to see these notebooks because it was one of the suitcase stories. God, we could do like a 10-hour talk about, we read 3 lines here. The suitcase story, the ways that history loses and finds things, was another thread through the dOCUMENTA. There are 3 suitcases in the dOCUMENTA. The suitcase that contained all of the papers of Georgi Lukács, that was in a bank until the 1980s, had been kept there for years and years and years and years and years, and that was then taken out, the famous Lukács suitcase, famous in the history of philosophy and cultural theory people, because it revolutionized what we know about Lukács, and everything was published from this famous suitcase. I heard about this suitcase from Agamben. George Agamben spoke to me about the Lukács suitcase. He quotes the Lukács suitcase in a certain number of his texts. He's on the 2nd column of this first page. Second suitcase is the suitcase of Charlotte Solomon works. Charlotte Solomon, Griselda talked to you about it. These were kept, they could have been lost. First of all, she draws her suitcase in a very famous gouache that becomes one of the main inspirations for William Kentridge's film Felix in Exile, and he's inspired by this suitcase drawing. And all the drawings of William fly out of the suitcase in Felix in Exile. But the suitcase could have been lost. This entire work of Charlotte Solomon could have been lost. So our cultural heritage passes through these cracks sometimes. It could be gone, could not be gone. She was transported to Auschwitz, but the works were collected in the custody of this person. Griselda knows the story much more. The third suitcase is Metzger's suitcase. Gustav Metzger is the artist who, in the late 1950s in the UK, coined the term, or did the manifesto of the art of destruction. At the time of the nuclear scare, Cold War, he is traumatized by his childhood. Gustav Metzger left Germany in the last transport out from Germany of Jewish children. Ends up in England, never sees his mother again. He probably had a suitcase with him because he always travels with his suitcase. And
I have to tell you something. We are negotiating doing an event with you and Gustav.
How interesting. I would love to do that.
In Leeds.
I would love to do that. He never lets go of his suitcase. He always carries his suitcase. But I believe that has something to do with this trip, this original trip when he was very young. And that this Cold War and the rise of the nuclear scare and the rise of the idea of the art of destruction as a movement and as a manifesto has something to do with the repetition of this trauma from his childhood. But when I went to visit Gustav Metzger, to ask him to be in the Documenta because of his having done the art of destruction and having never been in Documenta, even though he's the most important artist from a certain perspective, I think. While Gerhard Richter has been in the Documenta 100 times, same generation, he had been in, if you look it up, he's been in, but it's really only a print that was once in, it's not really a participation. He talks to me about his work, pre-Art of Destruction work. And he tells me that he had many drawings, hundreds of drawings, that had been carefully put away in a suitcase on top of a garage of a relative in London. And this suitcase that has the pre-Art of Destruction drawings are incredible. Drawings of a man and a woman making love, beautiful red pastels, the period from when he was a student of David Bomberg, period of when he went to Antwerp to copy Rubens and other incredible things. He didn't destroy them. When he started the Art of Destruction, he collected them and put them in a suitcase for 30 years. Again, 40 years, so time stopped. So this Documenta, my Documenta, we decided to show a selection of these 300 of these drawings, which were shown in vitrines in the Documenta Halle. So it's bringing back to visibility something that had become invisible, and it's paradoxical because it is the pre-Art of Destruction art of Gustav Metzger. So somehow it's again in a space of incredible hope about what it is that humans do in this very essential moment of drawing. You know, what it is to draw, what it is to take notes, what it is to make a notebook. So there are the 3 suitcases. So where were we? I better get to this. So Budapest. So that's why I was in Budapest. So then the next line, but we better get forward here. The next line is Rome, and I test my signature. And of course I publish this because it says this email is confidential and only for the person addressed, not to be further circulated. And I had sent it to myself, and then of course I am circulating it in this book. So I thought one of the many paradoxes of visibility and invisibility and instructions and the contradictions of instructions. But it does speak about a kind of confidentiality, or being in a position of confidence and kind of intimacy that you are when you're reading these private emails, because all of the next emails were also written without knowing that we would do the logbook. Okay, ethics. Of course I had to ask everybody if I could publish their email. But I never said it before that we would publish the emails, because it would have created an artificial condition of performativity and spectacle in everybody's emails. Emily Jassir refused to publish her emails. She said no. And Agamben, no, and Judith Butler also never answered. I asked her and she preferred not to, and that's fine. And Agamben also. So there were people who withdrew from this that they felt was wrong, you know, part of the virtuosic performativity. Actually, Judith Butler never replied to the email, and it was sent by Bettina. And I just let it drop. I didn't send it again. So this is important in the recording of it, because she did not decline, she never replied. And I respected that very much, as with, and it's fine. But Emily Jassir actually declined. So there are different systems by which a person can want or not want, you know, to, some people might feel it's the problem that we are dealing with, you know, the Facebook problem of everything which is very personal being out in the public is the problem of today. So you could be very against publishing these emails. But I thought, my thinking is that the problem with Facebook is that there's like an overflow of irrelevant information and there's so little that is meaningful. And so to do an editing, careful editing of a huge body of emails is the opposite impulse of Facebook. So I thought it was the right thing to do. So, okay. So then we skip a band, we go to, okay, so Agamben, this is important to me, this email, because I wanted to set the stage for a certain number of discussions. And I wrote, I would like to speak about certain questions It's in Italian. I also decided not to translate the emails, so they're in the language that I translated for you. Mi piacerebbe. I would like to speak about certain questions. So I took out some parts that were just personal parts. And I wrote, I would like to speak about certain questions. Quote, exhibit, unquote, versus, quote, inhibit, unquote. What it implies to pick or not pick, or to select or not to select, to, quote, put out, mettere fuori, unquote, or to show something. Also in relation to documenta, and what to do with this thing which is put out or not put out with the artists in the course of the upcoming years. So this question of exhibit and inhibit are the so-called secrets. You know, one of the criticisms that I received by the press, only by press, newspaper press, was that I was keeping secrets, you know. And for me, they're not secrets, but they're making space. So you don't tell everybody that you're taking all the artists to Breitenau so that you can take everybody to Breitenau. Because if you do that while you're doing Documenta, you're going to have Breitenau filled with press, and you're going to have an impossibility of going to Breitenau to do it. Because there might be polemics around, is it right or not right that she's going to visit Breitenau with the artist? So sometimes to hold your tongue, which is the subject of the only notebook that is not in this book. There is one author who refused to republish his notebook here, who withdrew from that, and that is Daniel Heller Roazen, and it is a notebook about when it is a good idea to hold one's tongue. Daniel Heller Roazen is a professor of Italian literature and translator of Agamben into English, young friend of Agamben. He translated almost all of Agamben into English. He teaches at Princeton or something, and he is the one who wrote the book called Ecolalias, on the forgetting of languages. He also recently wrote a book on pirates, the history of piracy, and so you can tell from his thinking about ecolalias on the forgetting of languages that the lack, the space of the lack or the absence is very important. So if you carefully look at this book, there will be one notebook missing. So the question of what to exhibit and what to inhibit, and what is the relation between exhibit and inhibit, and exhibitionism and inhibition, was at the basis of the whole document. And if you look at what we were talking about, Kabul and Kassel, in a way, Kassel is the ghostly other to Kabul, and Kabul is the ghostly other to Kassel. Alexandria and Banff were different, because Banff was a seminar on the concept of retreat, where a certain number of artists who are in Documenta and thinkers, from Catherine Malabou to Pierre Huyghe to Bifo, the Autonomia, Italian Autonomia, they were all in Banff and did this retreat on the subject of the retreat during a workshop of, not Play-Doh, clay sculpture. So the artists and philosophers were discussing retreat while learning to do clay work. And that was very few people. So when I speak about exhibition, I can only really speak about Kabul and Kassel. But Banff did have an exhibition, but the exhibition was a solo exhibition, because if you're going to do a project around the retreat and withdrawal, it makes no sense to make a group exhibition. So in Banff, there was a solo exhibition of Brian Jungen's work. Brian Jungen is an artist from the area near Banff. He is part Doneha and part Swiss, and so he was in a way hosting us. That was another reason for doing it in Banff. And in Kassel, his work was a sculpture garden for dogs, and therefore in the Aue Park, and you had to have a dog in order to go in it, to visit the pieces, because the pieces were not made for people, they were made for the pleasures of the dogs. So, like in normal dog parks, but it's as if a visual artist tries to make a really good dog park. That's it. There were other aspects to it that is a secret. If you saw an aerial view of these elements, they are actually letters and of an alphabet, and they say something. But he knows, and I don't know. But for him it was important that there was this thing that you could see from the sky. And so, I don't know it. But Brian Jungen was a solo exhibition in math. Okay, so this question of making space by emptying space is constant. Presence and absence is constant there. Okay, now the next
Carolyn,
was the situation.
Does anybody need a little bit of a sort of break or anything?
Sure.
Just for concentration, because I think some people may have to go. I mean, we can go on for a little bit, but I just wonder how people are feeling at this point. They need more chocolate biscuits or a break or something, or want to maybe ask a question.
Is the class over at 6 normally?
Technically, it's a 3-hour class, but because we've moved, because you're graduates, you're meant to work unbelievably hard. But I think possibly the quality of this, and I'm putting a lot of stress on you. So either we can
take a break, maybe 5 minutes.
We could take a little bit of a break with people like that, and then maybe concentrate on the sub-heap
pitch. Okay.
Pitch, because I think that's probably as much as anybody's going to take in, partly also because of the hard work it is to listen hour after hour in English for some of the students. It's a really enormous mental work that's going on.
Yes, and we should look at some pictures too.
And so I think maybe if we just have a little, if anybody wants to get themselves a drink or something,
we'll
we
see
just take
you
a
in
little
5
bit.
minutes.
And I can maybe get you something. Would you like something? I'm going to just, let me just see.